Can you name the biggest robbery in world history? Because there's been some massive heists. There's been, jewelry that has netted a few $100 million. There's been art collections that have been stolen. Saddam Hussein stole about $1 billion from the Iraqi people shortly before hiding out in that hole in the ground. Bernie Madoff scammed investors out of billions of dollars. Mubarak took, $76 billion for himself. But I'm telling you, those all look like petty convenience store thieves compared to the actual biggest robbery in history, except it's not in history, it's actually happening right now. Let me start here. The days of rage, Occupy Wall Street protests. What are these? What is this that we're seeing? Well, first, let me show you they were initially met with mockery. Here's Stephen Colbert.
I want a liberal. Some nut job in a burlap sack with a squirrel hat and goggles who does performance art nihilist puppet shows in the subway.
I guess one reason I do performance art, sort of nihilistic puppet shows in the subway and on the streets is because I don't really have any hope at all for the future of the world.
Liberals.
Okay, that sketch actually started with him playing a whole bunch of people that made sense to him about why they were out in the streets protesting. Well, as much as Comedy Central wants to help these guys out, I would like to warn you on who they are so you can warn your sons and daughters and everyone else that doesn't understand the free market system. Things turned violent over the weekend. 80 protesters have now been arrested for interfering and clashing with police on the streets. It has been 10 days since these protests began, and the president hasn't made any comment on them. Isn't that strange? I mean, here's the president of the United States who says we got to stabilize the system. We have to make sure that everybody knows that we're stable. We got to get more money to the banks. We got to get more money to the banks so things remain stable. But it has been 10 days, and he hasn't spoken out one bit about this. Even further, 10 days since the riots began, or the outcropping of these hippies, it was 188 days since we have exposed SEIU's Wall Street plan, where they outlined all of this and said, here's what they're going to do. 188 days ago, I told you this news. No one else has reported on it in the mainstream media. The president has been silent for 188 days. You'd think, with the press and the president wanting to stabilize things, wanting to make sure that there's no violence on the streets, he would look into that. You would think that somebody in the press... Remember the Egyptian riots? Mubarak steps down. How many days did it take for the president to speak out on that? To praise it? Same day. Same day. Spoke from the East Wing of the White House. Very same day. Now, do you remember the Iran riots? Remember everybody was taking their Twitter feed and Facebook and everything else and turning it green in support? How long did it take before the president came out and supported those guys? Remember, 0, 188. It took the president 2 days before the pressure got too strong. People were being slaughtered in the streets of Iran saying anything. For saying anything, slaughtered. Took him 2 days. Why? Didn't fit his agenda. Didn't fit his agenda. For someone who has this, if I give a speech with a teleprompter, it'll solve everything complex, he has a disturbing pattern here. If it fits his agenda, he does it. If it doesn't, well, then he won't say anything until it's too late, until blood is being spilled on the streets before daring to take a stand. Then it's just too late. The Days of Rage protests have been going on for over a week now, and it's picking up steam. While their initial protests were a little too vague, on their website 2 days before the protest, it said this: the Occupy Wall Street protesters have one demand. Here it is. On Saturday, thousands of us will occupy Wall Street. We will wave our signs, unfurl our banners, beat our drums, chant our slogans, and then we'll get down to business and hold several people's assemblies to decide what our one demand will be. There's something wrong. Now, I know this sounds ridiculous and you can easily ridicule it, but people thought I was ridiculous for pointing out the coming insurrection in 2009 because nothing was happening. Maybe a Molotov cocktail here and there. It looked a little like Wall Street today. But look what's happening in Greece just this weekend. Massive crowds and violence again in Greece. Here they are outside of Parliament. They also broke into a TV station. Watch this guy's eyes. Watch him shift over here. He's talking. Now he's going to look over to the side of, there he goes. Uh-oh, what's happening? You know what happened? They took him off the air right away because protesters broke into a national broadcast and took over the studios. How'd that happen? This is what happens when you ignore something. And quite honestly, I think more than that, when you're in league. Top down, bottom up, and inside out. Remember? These protests are part of what I believe is the biggest robbery in human history. And they are robbing you and me and every Western country blind. You remember all the banks? I got to go the other way. You remember all the banks and how the banks loaned to people they shouldn't have loaned to? Why did they make those loans? Why did they do that? They made those loans because they were afraid. Because the left came out and said, you are a racist. And then the government, like Barney Frank, came and said, you know what? I happen to agree with them, and we can't let you be racist like this. You better write those loans that people aren't qualified for. So they were afraid and they did nothing. The banks are culpable. But no less than those who told them to write the loans in the first place. Any of these big bankers knew then, just as they know now in their heart of hearts, that the bank loans wouldn't work out, and neither will these bailouts. But they won't say it out loud. Why? Well, I think for a couple of reasons. One, George Soros, just this weekend, because the alternative is just too terrible to contemplate. Soros says this. Now, I want you to know, he says this while he's saying, you got to give him more money. You got to give him more money, more bailouts, more bailouts, more bailouts. Soros is an architect. He is the Thomas Jefferson of the Nouveau Order. Remember, the idea of TARP was you'll never be able to restart the economy without having the banks having this cushion, enough money in their coffers to be able to loan it out and to make loans freer, to make sure people have that money to be able to start their own business, restart the heart of this economy. Let me show you something here. How much do the banks have in reserve now? This is January, there's September 2008, okay? This is TARP. This is when Barack Obama gets in, right about here. And he said, we're going to stop this, okay? Then it goes down, but now look at it. This is how much money they now have in reserve from here to here. They have that money in reserve so they can pay for the loans that they can't cover because of the collapse. That's the idea, right? If that's what's going on, well, let me ask you this way. Why isn't inflation a problem right now? I mean, I know it is, but it's not hyperinflation. Why is that? Because inflation is part of velocity of money. Money has to have a velocity. It has to be moving. Well, it's not. It's sitting in a bank vault. But if you have all of this money because you're preparing for a collapse, that means you have all that money to push it out in case you can't pay for anything. What happens if there's a collapse and they push that money out into the stream to pay for the things they couldn't afford? Whew. So who's responsible? Well, the Wall Street people have it down. It's the evil banks. The evil banks. Well, who are the evil banks? First of all, there's the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve System. What is it? It's a collection of all the biggest banks. It's America's federal banking system. A collection of banks created, of course, by Woodrow Wilson, so we would never, quote, have another financial crisis. Working out well, isn't it? A collection of banks. That's who the Fed is. We don't know which banks. We can't find out. Even though they're using our money, they're printing our money, they're tubing our system and our country, we don't even know who they are. You want to protest somebody? Protest the Fed. Now, who is the IMF? The IMF is even a bigger collection of banks. That's the International Monetary Fund. It's a collection of the banks, the biggest banks all around the globe. The ECB, that's the European Central Bank. That's a collection of banks in Europe. Okay, those are the evil banks.